Do you remember hearing about or seeing student anti-war protests?
Yeah, Charlie, that was those years brought out protests, not among students. It brought out a lot of student protests because it was just following the period of um, the civil rights movement and freedom of speech and so forth. So students, as well as others, really got into the mode of protest because they knew they had this right, and the civil rights movement was really like a forerunner to what occurred later in Vietnam because it just stimulated people knew that they had the right to protest, and they did, and the movement just sort of grew. So when this whole thing started, the students at that time, in order to recruit enough people for the war, they instituted a draft. You know what a draft is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's called conscription, where you had a draft card and you could be called up at any time. Well, this really did not sit well because the Vietnam War was very, very unpopular, and it escalated. The unpopularity increased really as the war years went along. Student protests occurred throughout, and they really weren't actually recruiting college students, but the fear was that they eventually would. And if you were a student, you were exempt. You really weren't going to go. But as more and more people were involved with the war effort, they just realized that through their eyes, the war was very, very wrong. And obviously they protested.
And our final question that we have for you is, what do you remember most about the war?
Well, as I mentioned, the idea that you could sit and watch this happen and year by year seeing this thing escalate and wondering how it's going to end. But the difference between that and how we experienced World War II is that during World War II, the people at home really were involved in the war. We had such things as rationing. Things where you could not buy things that were just they weren't available. You had ration stamps. You had air raids. You had at night they had air raid wardens, and you had to shut all of your lights and pull down shades so that you couldn't see any light through there. There were war bonds. People had their sons and daughters, in a war, and you could see stars in the window, which indicated those that were killed in the war, and so forth. You'd walk down the street and see who lost people and so forth. Whereas during this war, the home front was never. It's like we didn't have to give up anything. We were just sitting here while our sons and daughters and husbands and wives and things were going over there, losing their lives, fighting in this what we consider rather unnecessary war, being killed. Billions of dollars, but it didn't affect us on the home front as having to give up anything. You know what I mean by that? I mean, you didn't suffer on the home front with shortages, things that you couldn't have, things that you couldn't do. Life went on, and yet you knew that these people were over there fighting, and you had to support them because they were friends, they were family, and so forth, even though you felt that the war was wrong.